Hello and welcome back to the Beyond the Best podcast, the podcast that looks beyond the trophies and the medals, and we look into the world of sport and an elite athlete's journey to get to where they are today. This includes a lot of things that we do not talk about, and the podcast is here to talk about them. Today's episode, I would be lying if I said I'm a bit nervous about it, because I think it's going to stir up some emotions for sure. I think it's very important to talk about, and I think the underlying point that I'm going to be making throughout all of this is the only way things get better is if we talk about them. So today's episode is an athlete and their experience depending on their gender. The difference between man and woman. I think I'm crazy for doing this. Let's just get into it. Men versus women is an age-long conversation. There's a lot of viewpoints. People are very passionate about this topic, and I would probably be wrong to say that I think I definitely have some interesting views on this, but I think let's just go back to the basics a little bit. I just want to sort of establish the facts before we start getting into opinions and thought processes, and let's just sort of see where we're at with it. And I think there's obviously no denying the fact that men are biologically stronger than women. There's just no doubt about it. They've got more testosterone, they build more muscle mass, they have better bone density, and there's a lot of hormonal influences. 99% of the time, this makes them better at sport. You just cannot question that at all. I can think of one sport where men and women are probably on par with each other, and that's dressage, like horse riding. Difference in body strength is not advantageous when controlling a horse. That's why you do see men and women compete against each other. But that then just shows you that men and women cannot compete against each other. There's clearly differences, which gives men or women sometimes the advantage. So the point I'm trying to make, biology means men and women cannot compete against each other in sport because of the advantages men tend to have against a woman. So we've established the facts, like you can't deny them, and I'll struggle for anyone to try and tell me different. However, that doesn't change the fact that the history of sport has been very biased towards men. If you go right back in time to the ancient times, women did actually have sporting opportunities in athletics and equestrian. So basically, up until about the Victoria times, there were opportunities for women to partake in sport. Yes, it wasn't all of them like we see today, but there were definitely opportunities. But it's very interesting in history, when the Victorian times came about, women suddenly had this new persona in society. They were expected to be fragile and helpless, and their bodies couldn't possibly take on the strain of a raised heartbeat that sport entailed. The viewpoint was too much strain on the body would make the woman infertile and unable to produce children. And in those days, that's probably the only job of the woman, was to produce children for the man. And that's where it sort of went downhill for women. They were not allowed to partake in sport. As the 20th century developed, women were then allowed to play light sports such as tennis or even riding bicycles to get to places. This didn't exactly go down well because men thought it was an intrusion of their thing, their sport. Like women playing, it was intrusion. They did not like it. As a result of that, women who did partake in sport were perceived as masculine, unattractive and gay because they were going against the traditional beauty standards that were expected of them in society at that time. Throughout the 1900s, women continued to try and get some sort of equality in sport, and even as late as the 1988 Olympics, only 26% of athletes were women. It's when we reached the new millennium, we started to see some exceptional women come onto the sporting scene, such as Venus Williams, who in 2007 pushed to get the Wimbledon prize money the same as the male winner. And by the 2012 Olympics, 43% of athletes were women. So progress was definitely made, but this took over 100 years, and even then, still not equal. The opportunities were just not there. And as we fast forward today, it's still very evident that women in sport are not treated the same as men in sport. You only have to look at the likes of women's football or even women's basketball. The pay alone is so unbelievably unbalanced. And that is a huge barrier for getting more women into sport and actually seeing some sort of equality amongst men and women within sport. And this, I guess, is where the conversation sort of begins. I've given a bit of a backstory, but I think now is the time to sort of, let's look as to why this is the case. Why are we still in 2023 when there is a lot of progress being made in a lot of areas of society to sort of correct historic beliefs, shall we say, about many things? But why are we still in a situation where women's sport is just not as popular or as pivotal, I guess, in society? If I said to you, like, think of a sports person, like, just if you just created it and you just drew it, what would it be? It's like immediate thought in my head is it's a male, and that's just right or wrong. That is exactly what comes to mind. So why is that? Why are we at a point where men and women just cannot seem to get the balance in the sport world, even now? This often comes back to the argument about media coverage, and without media coverage, sponsorship isn't there. And the reason big salaries are there is because there's big sponsors who want the big exposure from the big media coverage. If you don't get the media coverage that women's sports doesn't get, why would anything else come along with it? Why would a sponsor you if they don't believe they're getting the coverage and exposure that they could get elsewhere? So we are definitely going to be discussing that a bit more. But what I will say before we continue with this, because I'm worried that this could come across a bit like a biased conversation, and I do not want this to be the case. I want this to be a balanced discussion, really. History was very good to white males in sport who were rich. If you were not that, you had no access to the gentleman's sport, which was football at one point, and many sports have come from that. Men as a whole have not had the easy ride that is potentially portrayed in the media. There is a select group of men that without doubt have had the easiest ride compared to anyone else in society. But if you put that as a proportion of the population, it's just so small. So I do think you have to be careful when you say about men versus women and who's had it easier. There is a very small portion that have benefited massively, but then there's been a much bigger majority of people who have suffered at the hands of sport and its popularity within society, depending on your situation and circumstance. And I think there is also an argument on the back of that to say that, yes, there is a big struggle between men and women being equal within sport, but there is also a huge diversity issue between men in sport. And I would say it's taken as long to get to this point with the diversity in sport for males as it has for women to get to the point where they're at. So yes, it's men versus women, but I do think sometimes there's a conversation to be had about men versus men. So let's dive down a little bit into the reasons as to why there is a difference between popularity between men and women sports, especially those where women and men play the same sport just in their own categories. The obvious examples is women's football versus men's football, the women's basketball versus men's basketball. The men's versions of those sports are huge, like easily within the top 5 sports of the world. As a result of that, this statistic has not changed for the last 30 years in the fact that 95% of media coverage is of male athletes. And even in the modern day, only 10% of social media coverage is of women. So there is a huge disparity between the exposure the population and society gets to women's sport. The whole reason that the male version of the sport is so much more popular is because obviously the media are spending a lot more time talking about these people, talking about what's going on in their personal lives and everything that comes with that. And that is just not happening with women's sport. But there is a chicken and an egg situation here, because is the support and the interest of women's sport any higher than the media coverage that it's getting? I'm not saying yes or no to this, by the way. I'm merely asking a question. So, is it proportional? Is it just not covered as much because it just genuinely is not as popular? Men's sport is effectively 9 times more popular than a women's sport. And when you put it like that, potentially. but why? Or is it because there isn't media coverage, so the media interest hasn't gained a following and people have not been exposed to women's sport in the way that they have been men's sport over these decades? So is it kind of the media's fault there's 9 times less interest in women's sport because they aren't covering it, so people aren't seeing it? And that's where you sort of have to play it against, like, who should be the person that breaks this cycle? Should it be the general population trying to show more of an interest or learning more about it? But how do they do that if the media are not covering it? So therefore the media should be the ones increasing coverage and making it more easily accessible. But the media is a business, and if there isn't interest in it, are they investing money where there isn't going to be a return? And that is the problem, isn't it? Because if they don't feel like they're going to get a return on their investment into the world of women's sport, why would they put any sort of coverage into it? I think that's probably a very matter-of-fact way of looking at it, and there's probably some very big other underlying reasons as to why women's sport has less exposure at all, and I will come on to that. But in terms of media coverage, I do think it is a very hard cycle to break, because how do you prove that there's an interest if there isn't media coverage to gain the following? But why would you increase your media coverage if you cannot see that the interest is there? And I don't know how you break that. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, this is why we talk about it, because it's conversations like this that you expose people to a world or a conversation that they've not seen before, or B, it shows people who potentially have some control over media exposure that there is an interest, and this is maybe something they should put more effort and time into. I don't know the answer to this. I'd be very interested to know what you all think. The media is a very funny thing, and I think the big topic that I think is the obvious one to mention is the fact that, is the media just sexist? Has the media got a fundamental problem with praising women for their success within sport? Because are they a bit stuck in their ways, have sort of retained this underlying subconscious thought that women don't belong in sport? I don't mean that in a sense of being like they don't want women to play sport, but I think it's more so thinking men being part of sport is just better. And that's where the sexism lies, because they don't allow for women to achieve as much and get the same praise. Going on from this point ever so slightly, if you look back 10, 20, 30 years, any coverage of a woman in the media was quite sexualized and based on appearance, and never spoke about achievements. It was never a very complimentary thing towards a woman. Amazingly so, that has reduced. But as a result of that, it hasn't made the media coverage the same in terms of how a man is reported about versus a woman. If you look, especially within sport, how women are portrayed, it is a lot more one-dimensional and bland. And I think that can create a belief that the sport they are then taking part in is dull and boring. Why would you have an interest in a sport a woman is playing if you are not interested in that woman that's being spoken about or reported on? And the media control that. You can't deny that. That's their angle of reporting on women's sport on the whole. On top of this, male athletes, especially the ones that are in the public eye, are very successful. You hear so much about what's going on in their personal lives, probably to their demise, too much so, which again isn't fair, not right. So it almost completely goes the other way. But it creates excitement within the sport, because people create a relationship or a vested interest in these athletes because they feel like they know them. They think, oh, we've seen them in the papers doing this, or they were here doing that. Oh, and now I see them on the pitch playing the sport. I'm going to be really involved in this. I'm excited. I'm invested. When was the last time you saw something about a woman, an athlete, and something that they were doing outside of their sport? And to be honest with you, I can't think of a time when I've seen that, honestly. And I would wonder how I'd even go about trying to find that. Maybe their own Instagrams. I don't know, you just don't. So the fact is, there is a lot more interest in the male athletes than a woman as an athlete. There is also an inequality in society as to what we allow a woman to do versus a man. For instance, Simone Biles is the most decorated American gymnast in history. And if she was to say she was the best in the world, the response in the media and from society would be that she is cocky, arrogant, full of herself, and hated. Because how dare she say that? Because who does she think she is? Like, it's just not allowed. However, if you have the likes of Michael Jordan, who is arguably the best basketballer in history, however, there is many discussions around whether that's true, or maybe LeBron James is, and there are arguments for and against that title for him. He doesn't have medals to say that he is the best in the world. That's what I mean. There's no physical proof. But if he was to sit there and say, I'm the best basketballer in the world, no one would comment about whether he's being arrogant, cocky, or full of himself. They would just be like, well, it's either you or him, but we'll accept what you've just said. Like, we don't actually have a problem with what you've said. It's whether we agree with it's the right person. That's why has society got a problem with a woman saying the same thing as a man? Like, why are the reactions so different? I don't understand this personally, and I'd love to know why. And does it come back from a bit of a sexist thing within the world of sport, or just a bit sexism in society as a whole? We cannot be happy for the success of a woman, because is there some sort of subconscious thing here where we don't want them to succeed because it's the men that do all of that, and low-key the women are kind of the people in the background supporting? Is that what it is? Like, if we see a woman succeed, it bothers us. Why does it bother us? And I'm not saying this is a man thing. Women do it all the time, and I see it more with women against other women than I do men having a problem with a woman. That is really interesting to me. So you then have to think, hang on a second, if women can't even back other women up, where do we even start with fixing this? Because these people should be we should be working together as a team to go, like, let's try and equal this out a little bit. But it just doesn't happen. Like, we are literally tear each other down because, I don't know, is it a jealousy thing? Like, we want to be what they're doing, and rather than going, do you know what, I rate your success and I'm going to try and get there too, it's like, you're awful. And by the way, we'll then comment something about how they look. That is the first insult we do. Like, why do we do that to each other? Why is that a thing? But I think it goes back to the very olden days where the only value of a woman was how she looked. How do we change this? Because if the media, and we're in a social media environment where we're constantly being fed this narrative where women, we don't like it when women do well and we love it when men do well, where does that change? Like, how do we go about changing that? Who does that? Who facilitates that? Is it conversations like this where it makes you realize actually how ingrained you are in a society's belief that you don't even realize you've got? Because I certainly don't, and I shock myself sometimes the way I think, and I'm like, okay, that's not right. But it's how do you do that? Because the media coverage of men and women and how we respond to their presence in media is not the same. So if we've got an imbalance in coverage and an imbalance in responses, where does this change happen, start, begin? What do we do? How do we almost reset this and understand that we talk to everyone the same way? But I don't think we ever will, because men and women are different. You cannot deny that. There are many reasons beyond physical structure where men and women are different. And there is this traditional roles of a man and a woman. And is that potentially what the problem is we are all a bit stuck in a belief from a long time ago, and whilst we're very forwards and we like to say we don't conform to those beliefs, we are in a society that tells us these things whether we like it or not. And I think you get told it subconsciously more than what you realise, and that is a bit difficult because that is a really deep thing to sort of unpick and relearn, reteach across everywhere. This is not just sport. It's very, very prominent in sport, granted, but I don't know where the change begins. It's very important for me to keep this a fair argument, otherwise the whole point of this podcast is completely void. Women athletes have a very difficult time in the media in the sense that they just don't get it. However, I think it would be very wrong to infer that by women having a difficult time, men have it easy, because they don't. A lot of athletes do not go in the sport to become famous. There definitely are, and there's definitely some that are very excited by the fame that comes with being successful in their sport. But the media coverage of men is borderline intrusive. It's very rare a very successful athlete will ever be written on, reported on, just on their sporting events. Whilst they are scrutinised in their sporting world, they are also scrutinised in their personal lives. Their privacy is invaded constantly, and to an extent, that's because the media is looking for something to tear them down. So it's not like men are praised as athletes and we all want to think they're amazing and successful. It's the fact that the media actually gives them more coverage, is more intrusive, and then loves it when they can tear them down because it creates big headlines. And that is a massive thing to take on as an athlete, because who goes to work and is judged by what they were doing at home? Who even knows what they were doing outside of work? Like nobody. They don't like that. They just don't, like, unless you tell them, they're not going to, like, they don't have an awareness of what you do outside of your job, which is quite normal. I think it's very good to have a private life, hence why it's called that, and your work life. Why do male athletes not get that? Why do we as a society feel like we've got this right to know this athlete in every aspect of their life, to the point where there's like phone hacking and all of that? Why do we want to know about this so badly when this person is only really got fame because of their sport? They did not sign up for any of the other things. And women on the whole do not have that as a problem. They don't have that level of invasion of privacy or the desire to seek something out so much to destroy them. I think they have that challenge elsewhere, but I think on the whole, women athletes do have their privacy so much more than men do. And if you brought the media coverage up to a balance, that would probably entail women having to experience more of what the men have to go through. And do they want that? And I'm going to probably say no, they don't, because I can't imagine many people would. So is the benefit of not getting the media coverage that they would like better than getting the media coverage and then having to deal with all the negative side effects that come with that? And I don't know if that's a very good argument. Is that something we even need to talk about? Or is that something that women, we shouldn't be protecting them? Do you know what? It should be equal and everyone should deal with everything the same. Or is it going to be one of those things that, okay, if they made it equal, then they start complaining that their lives are being completely intruded and they have no privacy? I don't know, because I think there probably are a lot of male athletes that would much rather not have the media coverage and take some level of pay cut to have their private lives to be completely private and actually no one to have any interest in that. You can't have both. So what is the one you want? And I'm not saying it has to be the way it is now, because it definitely can be more balanced, and the media coverage of women's sport could be increased just purely by how much sport is being covered. And I'm not saying that's the case, but half of the reason the popularity of these sports is where it's at is because people are so invested in the players or the athletes that they are watching, because they have had their lives completely exposed and all privacy removed. It's a very interesting thought. And I don't have the answers. And I think half of this is about talking about it, to bring the questions up, to have a conversation and see what people's points of view are. Because the reason the media coverage is rubbish is for women and too much for men is not necessarily come from good reasons. But if it was to change, it's still not going to be perfect. And what do you want more, I think, is probably what I'm asking. And also, like, remembering that with extra coverage is you are judged for so much more than what you do in your profession. And if you think about the likes of David Beckham, he's a fantastic footballer. He's had an incredible career, but he led a very, to an extent, squeaky clean career, and has since then benefited from that and is portrayed as this amazing family man. He was just very good at keeping his life to the media positive. But there are also athletes, footballers again, because I guess they are the people on the whole who get the most negative media, that have slipped up slightly in their personal lives, had amazing careers, but do not have the same reputation and love and respect in the world now because of what they did outside their sport. Is that fair? I'm not sure it is. And I think that is something that we don't talk about. Like, That's an unfairness on male athletes. Our opinions are formed on them because we learn more about them and we know who they are because of all of this extra media coverage outside the sport. But is it fair that we decide their legacy effectively is based on a media's ability to dig dirt from their lives? Everyone has dirt, and there are many people who are suffering because of the media just found it easier to dig the dirt on them. That's not fair either. So there's so much unfairness. It's like, which one do you want? I'm wary for saying this because I think it can sort of come across a bit like women stop moaning. You've got it easy. Yes, you don't have the media coverage, but you don't have everything else. And that is an argument, and it is, and you cannot deny that that is a point. But the other side to it is really not as good. I don't know. I genuinely don't know the answer to this, and I don't know which one. I guess women could possibly just say, do you know what? I wish we just had the choice for it. I wish we weren't forced into this type of coverage. But then again, I guess the man could argue, I wish we had a choice to have no coverage, because we don't get that either. It is a really tricky one, and maybe that's why we're at a situation where things aren't changing as quickly as what we'd expect them to, given the times we're in now, is because the answer really is not that simple. If we move on a little bit and blame the media less for the equality between men and women's sports in society, what are other reasons as to why we're in the situation that we're in? I think you really do have to ask, does the world on the whole just prefer watching men play sport? There may be many reasons as to why that happens, but if the answer to that question is yes, you can't really blame everything that's happened beyond that. If you look at it as a business case, if one product is more popular than the other, you would not invest the same amount of money in both those products if the return on the investment of one of them was much greater than the other. It makes zero business sense. Sport is a business. It's there for our entertainment. There are many things it provides, but at the end of the day, it is a money gainer. I do wonder maybe that we put too much emphasis on societal issues into sport. Yes, men and women have an issue with equality outside of sport, and I'm not saying that should be something we should stop talking about. What I'm saying is, within sport, as a business, does it make sense that men's sports earns more money because it's just more popular? And I think you kind of have to argue yes. You really, that is true. On the flip side, do we prefer watching male sport because we've been exposed to it for longer? Women have just not had the coverage to gain the audience over the decades leading up to this point. So are we just so used to watching men play sport that we like what we know and we're comfortable with, and when something new comes around we're a bit like standoffish and going, nah, I'm not into that. I like what I know, and I don't want to rock the boat. I just want what I know I'm comfortable with. And the biggest changes come from people who just stand up and go, no, we're going to do this and you're going to like it or you're not, but we're still going to do it. Fine, do it. But I don't think you can be surprised that there is a big part of society that are a bit like, I'm still good with doing what I know. And this is an interesting statistic to back up what I've been saying. Bearing in mind the Women's World Cup football was this year, there was 249 million hours of viewerage, if that's a word, of women's football, which sounds incredible. But this was the World Cup, so this was when there was a lot more media attention on the women's football than there ever had been, so a lot more people have been exposed to it. However, this year alone, when there's been no major competition in men's football, there has been 1 billion hours of football watched. And that's just in the UK. So numbers don't lie. If sport is a business, there is 75% more interest in men's football. Why would you invest more in women's football? It might not even be the media coverage that has created this. Is it just because men are physically more able to produce a higher quality of football because of their physical advantages that best women in the world would never be able to play against the best men in the world in football or any sport? So are we actually just more interested in the better quality of sport? And I'm not trying to tear women down in saying this, because I don't want to take away from their elitism within the sport, because obviously to get to where they are in their sport, to be the best is an amazing achievement. But if they're still not good as the best men, how bothered can you truly be if a person has got an hour to watch football, they're going to spend their time watching the best type of football, aren't they? They're going to want the best kind of entertainment. And I think it's really difficult to say this, because I think I'm really wary of making it sound like women are just not as good as men. But unfortunately, because of the disadvantages they have physically and biologically, they just don't provide the performance a man can. And I think there's probably many criteria into what goes into a performance, but if you just go, I'm struggling to say this because I'm very wary of how this comes across, but I think it just comes down to the fact if a man is providing a better experience in sport because of their physical advantages, you can't be upset when someone is choosing to spend their time watching the man play the same sport as what the woman is playing. And I think that's a hard pill to swallow, but you can't hate that, because if you were to put a similar scenario in another situation that wasn't between a man and a woman, for instance, if two children were colouring in and you just happen to watch these two children colouring in, you're going to watch them like if you're at a kid's party or something, like it's what it is. If Bob Ross is in the corner painting one of his like exceptional landscapes, you're probably going to watch Bob Ross, aren't you? Like, you're not going to sit and watch the children colour in when you could watch someone who is more able at what they're doing. And I'm not saying women are children in colouring, and I'm not, but I'm just trying to prove that, like, if there's something more is better to watch, you're going to do that, no matter who it is, what it is. Like, that's just the situation. And I think it's important to bring that to the conversation, because I think sometimes conversation can become a bit too much about the unfairness of everything and not so much the facts of that is just what happens. Like, on the whole, like, life isn't fair. So why do we always try to make things fair when that's just not the way the world works? Women are very good in other areas and excel more than men. If sport is not one of those things, why is there a bit of a, maybe I'm looking at this in the wrong way, but I do feel like sometimes there's a bit of a viewpoint where we almost have to prove that women are just as good as men in sport, when like it's just not possible. Like, so maybe if we change our mindset around it, we could create an environment where women do benefit in the world of sport, but we aren't constantly comparing them to men. Why can't we create a whole new platform and environment for women in sport where it's not just a woman's version of the man's sport? Because that's effectively how it's described, whether that's correct or not. So maybe what the answer is, we need to sort of separate it completely and accept that a woman never going to be as good at a sport as a man. So let's remove that comparison and try and see it for what it is. How do you remove a comparison when they're doing the same thing? And maybe that is difficult, isn't it? How do you possibly try to separate it when the only thing that's different between the two scenarios is the gender of the athlete? I have an awful lot more to say on this topic, and I am very aware that this is a longer podcast than what I've done usually, and I do like to keep it quite concise, more to the point, and actually I want to give you enough time that you don't stop thinking. I want you to continue with a good thought process and come up with questions and contribute to the conversation. So I'm going to continue this next week. I'm going to do a part 2. So I feel like I give every argument a valid amount of airtime, really, to think about it. So I have played devil's advocate a lot in this podcast, and I also am very wary that it can come across in certain arguments that I'm trying to side with on the men, or even I'm trying to make out that men have it too easy and women are the ones suffering. And I think the point I'm probably going to finish on is the fact that I don't think it's easier for one or the other. I just think in certain areas of the sport world, it is more advantageous to be a man or a woman, depending on what you want out of it. Let me know what you think. Please have a discussion. I want to know about your thoughts and opinions on this, and I will continue this conversation next week, hopefully with a few comments to add to this. Thank you very, very much for watching and listening to this podcast. You can find me on YouTube and Spotify. And don't forget to go follow me on Instagram, where you can see some clips and updates and just keep up to date with the podcast of what's happening, and also find out when the latest episode is released. But until next time, this has been the Beyond the Best podcast, and I will speak to you very soon.